I was 63 years old the first time I noticed how loud silence could be. Not the quiet you get after a long day, the kind that feels earned. This was different. This was the silence of a house built for 4 people that now held only one woman rattling around inside it. My husband passed away 2 years earlier. My son lived 3 states away with his own family, and my daughter called every Sunday out of duty more than anything, 10 minutes of updates about her kids before she had to go. The house itself hadn't changed. Same brick exterior, same maple tree out front that we'd planted the year we bought the place. Same driveway that still cracked in the same spot every winter. But somewhere along the way it had stopped being a home and started being a structure I happened to sleep in. I want to explain what that emptiness actually felt like, because people who haven't lived it tend to imagine something dramatic. It wasn't dramatic, it was small. It was pouring coffee for one and putting the second mug back in the cabinet out of habit before remembering there was no second person coming. It was walking past my late husband's reading chair every morning and feeling my chest tighten just slightly, every single time, like stepping on the same bruise in the same spot. It was turning the heat up in winter because the house felt cold even when the thermostat said 72. I don't think that cold ever came from the furnace. If any part of that sounds familiar to you, stay with me for this one. This is a story about what happens when you finally decide to do something about it. For a long time, I told myself this was simply what retirement looked like for a woman alone. I filled my days with small tasks. I mowed a lawn that didn't need mowing. I reorganized a garage that was already organized. I watched the news longer than I needed to because it filled the silence with voices, even if those voices weren't speaking to me. My daughter suggested a grief group. My son suggested a dog. I tried the dog for about 6 months before realizing I wasn't lonely for companionship in the abstract. I was lonely for connection, and there's a difference most people don't think about until they're forced to live inside it. It was my neighbor, of all people, who changed things, though neither of us knew it at the time. Rachel had retired a year before me and spent half of every year in a small town outside Cebu with her husband's family. One evening she came by to return a ladder and ended up staying for 2 hours, showing me pictures on her phone. Not tourist pictures, pictures of people. Her husband's nieces climbing on him like he was furniture. A table so full of food it looked like it might collapse. An old woman, her husband's grandmother, laughing so hard in one photo that her eyes had disappeared into her cheeks. I asked her, half joking, if she ever got bored out there. She looked at me like I'd asked something absurd. Bored, she said. I haven't been bored once. I've been tired. I've been overwhelmed. I've eaten more than any woman my age should eat. But bored? No. There's always someone at the table. That sentence stayed with me longer than I expected. There's always someone at the table. I sat with that phrase for weeks, turning it over the way you turn over a stone looking for what's underneath it. My table at home sat 6. It had sat 1 for 2 years, and most nights I didn't even bother sitting at it. I ate standing at the counter, plate in hand, because a table built for a family felt almost mocking when there was nobody across from me. I didn't decide to visit the Philippines because of some grand epiphany. I decided because Rachel mentioned a flight deal, and because for once I didn't have a good reason to say no. My daughter thought I was going through some kind of late-life crisis. My son thought it was a nice idea for a vacation, the same way he might have suggested Florida. Neither of them understood that I wasn't looking for a vacation. I was looking for evidence that warmth still existed somewhere, and that I was still capable of feeling it. The flight was long enough that I had far too much time to think. Somewhere over the Pacific, I found myself doing the math on my life, the way people do when they're staring out a window at nothing in particular. 63 years old, widowed, Children grown and settled into their own worlds. A house that ran like clockwork and felt like a museum. I remember thinking that if I died tomorrow, the house would simply keep standing there, lights off, mail piling up in the box, until someone finally noticed and came to check on it. Landing in Manila hit me the way it hits everyone the first time, though nobody tells you properly beforehand. The heat wrapped around me before I'd even cleared the jet bridge, thick and immediate, nothing like the dry summers back home. The noise outside the airport was constant, a layered hum of horns and voices and engines that never fully quieted, not even at night, I'd learn later. Rachel's brother-in-law picked us up, and within the first 10 minutes of the drive I understood why Rachel had stopped trying to explain Manila traffic to me over the phone. Words don't do it justice. You simply have to sit in it, gripping the door handle, watching motorcycles slip through gaps that shouldn't exist. We weren't staying in Manila long, just enough to rest before heading south to the province where Rachel's husband's family lived. That first night in a hotel room, I sat on the edge of the bed the way I imagine a lot of people do their first night somewhere unfamiliar, running through a quiet inventory of doubt. What am I doing here? Why did this seem like a good idea? I'm too old for this kind of disruption at my age. I didn't say any of it out loud, but it sat heavy in the room with me, the way doubt does when there's nobody else there to talk you out of it. The next morning changed something, though I couldn't have told you exactly what at the time. We took a smaller flight south, then a van ride through roads that grew narrower and greener with every mile, until eventually we pulled up outside a house that didn't look like much from the outside. Simple, concrete, a tin roof, a small yard with a mango tree standing crooked from years of typhoons. But before Rachel had even finished getting out of the van, people were pouring out of that house. Children first, running barefoot across the yard, shouting her name before they'd even reached the gate. Then adults calling out greetings, already reaching to take our bags before we'd asked for help. I remember standing there a little stunned because nobody was performing hospitality. Nobody was being polite for the sake of appearances the way people sometimes are back home when a stranger shows up unannounced. They were simply glad we were there, in a way that felt entirely unguarded. Within 20 minutes, I was sitting at a table that had clearly been added onto to fit more people, a plate in front of me that someone had filled without asking, an old woman patting my hand and telling me, through Rachel's translation, that I looked too thin and needed to eat more. I want to be honest about something. I didn't fall in love with the Philippines because of a single beautiful moment. It happened slowly, the way warmth actually works, which is nothing like the movies make it look. It happened over the accumulation of small things. It happened when I noticed that nobody in that house ever seemed to eat alone. It happened when I realized the television stayed off most evenings because people would rather sit outside and talk to each other instead. It happened when a little girl of maybe 7, a distant cousin of Rachel's husband whose name I hadn't even learned yet, climbed into the chair beside me one evening and simply sat there, watching the sunset with me, entirely comfortable in the silence between two people who couldn't fully understand each other's language. I stayed for 3 weeks instead of the 10 days I'd planned. Then I stayed for 6. My daughter called twice during that stretch, her voice tight with the particular worry adult children get when a parent does something unexpected. "Mom, what's going on out there?" I gave her an honest answer, though I'm not sure it fully satisfied her. I told her I was eating dinner with people every single night. I told her that for the first time in 2 years, I wasn't dreading the evenings the way I used to dread them back home, watching the clock crawl toward bedtime just so the day would finally be over. There was a particular night that I think about more than any other. It had rained hard that afternoon, the kind of tropical downpour that arrives without warning and leaves the streets steaming within the hour. The power went out around dusk, as it sometimes did there, and instead of everyone retreating to separate rooms with flashlights the way I imagine a similar outage would go back home, the entire household gathered on the porch. Someone lit candles. Someone else brought out a guitar that had clearly been played more than it had been tuned. An uncle told a long, meandering story about a typhoon from decades earlier that grew more dramatic with every retelling, judging by the way the family groaned and laughed at parts they'd obviously heard a dozen times before. I sat there in the candlelight, surrounded by people who had known me for barely a month, and I felt something I hadn't felt in longer than I wanted to admit. I felt included without having to ask for it. Back home, inclusion required effort. It required scheduling, phone calls, driving somewhere, making plans weeks in advance that often fell apart anyway. Here it seemed to simply happen, the way water finds its way downhill without anyone directing it. If you believe that people deserve a second chapter, no matter how old they are when it arrives, that's really what this channel is about. Consider subscribing, because there's more of this story left, and more like it coming. When I finally flew home after nearly 2 months, the house felt different the moment I walked through the door. Not because anything had physically changed, but because I now had a clear memory of what a full table sounded like, and the contrast was almost unbearable. I stood in my kitchen that first evening back, and the silence pressed down on me in a way it hadn't before I left, because now I knew exactly what was missing. It's one thing to live inside an absence you've never questioned. It's another thing entirely to have felt its opposite and then lose it again. I spent the following months in a strange in-between state. I was physically home, going through the motions of my old routine, but some part of me was still sitting on that porch, with the candles and the guitar and the sound of rain on a tin roof. I called Rachel more than I probably needed to, asking questions I already half knew the answers to, mostly because talking about it kept the feeling alive a little longer than it otherwise would have. My daughter noticed the change before I said anything directly. She mentioned, almost offhand, that I sounded different on the phone. Lighter, she said. Like something in you loosened up, Mom. I didn't tell her the whole reason. Not yet. I just said maybe the trip did me some good. It took me another year to make the decision that would have seemed unthinkable to the version of myself who used to reorganize an already organized garage just to fill an empty afternoon. I sold the house. Not impulsively, not without long nights of doubt where I questioned whether I was chasing a feeling that wouldn't hold up under permanence the way it had under a temporary visit. There's a difference, I kept telling myself, between a good vacation and a good life, and I wasn't entirely sure I could trust myself to know which one I'd actually found. But every time I sat with that doubt, I kept arriving at the same conclusion. The house I owned had 4 bedrooms and 1 occupant. It had a dining table built for 6 that I ate at alone, when I bothered to eat at the table at all. It represented a life that no longer existed, and I had been keeping it standing out of habit rather than purpose. The way you keep paying for a gym membership you stopped using months ago, simply because canceling feels like admitting something. My son struggled with the decision more than my daughter did. He asked me directly if I was running away from something. I understood the question, because I'd asked myself something close to it more than once, usually at 2 in the morning when doubt tends to visit uninvited. But the answer, when I finally sat with it honestly, wasn't that I was running from grief or loneliness or an empty house. I was running toward the version of my life where dinner meant something again, where evenings had voices in them, where a knock at the door was a welcome interruption rather than a mild alarm that made me wonder who could possibly be stopping by unannounced. I bought a small piece of land not far from the family that had taken me in that first visit, close enough that I could walk to their house within 10 minutes if I needed to. Building slowly, the way things tend to happen there, patient in a way that used to frustrate me back home, and now simply feels honest, unhurried in a way I've come to respect rather than resent. In the meantime, I rented a small place nearby, modest, nothing close to the size of the house I'd left behind, and somehow it has never once felt empty, not for a single evening. The differences in daily life took adjustment, and I won't pretend otherwise. The heat still catches me off guard some afternoons, standing in a blouse that's soaked through before I've walked 2 blocks. The bureaucracy involved in moving your entire life to another country tested a patience I didn't know I had. Forms and stamps and offices that closed for lunch at the exact moment I needed them open. There were nights early on when I missed the specific quiet of my old street, the smell of autumn leaves burning somewhere a few houses down, the particular blue of a Midwestern sky in October that I've never quite found the equivalent of here. Those things are real, and I don't discount them, but they exist alongside something that had been missing for years, and that something outweighs the homesickness more often than not, especially once the sun goes down and the neighborhood starts to gather the way it always does. What surprised me most wasn't the culture or the food or even the weather, though all of that has its own charm I've come to appreciate. What surprised me was how quickly an empty life can refill itself once you put yourself somewhere warmth is allowed to happen naturally, without needing to be scheduled or forced or explained. Back home, I had structured my entire day around avoiding the silence. Here, I don't think about avoiding anything, because the silence rarely shows up long enough to need avoiding in the first place. There's a niece who stops by most mornings on her way to work, just to say hello and steal a piece of fruit off the counter. There's an elderly neighbor who insists on sending food over whenever she cooks too much, which according to her is always, without exception. There's a table, most evenings, with more people around it than chairs originally intended for, the same way it was that very first night I arrived and didn't yet understand what I was walking into. Sophia, the little girl from down the road who I've more or less unofficially adopted as a granddaughter of sorts, asked me once why I moved so far from my real family. I told her the truth, as best as I understood it myself. I said my family back home will always be my family, and I miss them, and that will never change no matter how far away I live. But I told her that a house isn't a home just because people who are related to you happen to be living in it. A house becomes a home when it's full, in whatever way full happens to look for that particular life. Mine had stopped being full a long time before I ever set foot on a plane, and I hadn't even fully admitted that to myself until I felt the difference somewhere else. I still call my children every week. I still miss the particular sound of my son's voice when he used to run through my kitchen as a boy. Still catch myself wishing I could sit across from my late husband one more time and tell him about all of this, knowing he would have loved it more than I ever could have predicted back when he was still here to ask. Grief doesn't disappear just because you find warmth again. It simply stops being the only thing occupying the room. What I know now, sitting on a porch that isn't nearly as large as the house I used to own, surrounded most evenings by people who have no blood relation to me at all, is that warmth was never about geography in the way I originally assumed it was. I didn't need the Philippines specifically. I needed a place where being present with other people wasn't treated as an exception to daily life, but as the default setting of it, the assumed condition, rather than the rare event. I happen to find that here. Someone else might find it somewhere entirely different, and I don't think the location is really the point. But I think about that empty house often, the one with the maple tree and the dining table built for 6. I think about how cold it felt even with the heat running full blast, and I understand now that no furnace was ever going to fix that particular kind of cold. It wasn't the temperature that was missing. It was the people, the noise, the sense of being needed by someone close enough to reach out and touch. I had spent years waiting for the ache to fade on its own, the way you wait for weather to pass, and it never did, because grief and loneliness don't actually work like weather. They work more like rooms. You either fill them deliberately and on purpose, or you learn to live inside the draft. Mine is full now, not in the way it used to be, not with the same people or the same language or the same holidays I grew up with, but full in the way that matters most, which I've slowly come to believe is the only way that ever really did. If this story meant something to you, subscribe for more of these journeys, and tell me in the comments about the moment your own house started to feel warm again. I read every one.